Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I found a dark web stream that shows what the news won't. I wish I never watched it. I never thought I'd end up being that guy who wandered into the dark web and came out with a story people wouldn't believe. And no, it wasn't because I was chasing some thrill or looking for anything illegal. Honestly, I was bored. Quarantine had been dragging on for months, and I'd finished almost every show, every random YouTube series. I wanted something new, something different. That's how I found myself in a Reddit rabbit hole about hidden sites on the deep web. Most of it sounded like internet folklore, secret marketplaces, weird cult websites, crazy conspiracy stuff. But one comment, buried way down, caught my eye. Someone mentioned a stream called Undercurrent. They described it like it was some kind of live, underground news network, but it only covered the things mainstream media wouldn't or couldn't show. There was a hint of mystery, but nothing overly sinister, and honestly, it just seemed like some wannabe Vice network trying too hard to be edgy. Curiosity got the best of me, and I followed the thread, piecing together just enough info to figure out how to get there. Now, I've never really been on the dark web, and I wasn't exactly tech savvy, so it took me a few tries, but eventually I found the site. The landing page was simple, just a black screen with white text that read, "Undercurrent, we show the real truth." I sat there for a second, questioning whether this was a good idea, but I clicked through. The stream loaded slowly, like it was fighting against my internet, but after a few moments, a video window opened, and there it was, a live feed. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. It was shaky footage, like someone was walking through an abandoned neighborhood. The audio was scratchy, but I could make out whispers, or maybe they were just distant voices. I leaned closer, trying to catch any hint of what was happening. But then, out of nowhere, the camera panned, and I saw him. There was a man, standing dead still in the middle of the road, facing away from the camera. He was wearing a hoodie, his hands shoved into his pockets, his posture slouched, like he'd been waiting there a while. The person filming stayed back, almost hesitant, as if they didn't want to get too close. I felt my pulse quicken, and I wondered if I was just watching a pre-recorded video that someone had uploaded to give people a scare. But then the timestamp updated, and it hit me. This was live. The camera started moving again, slowly edging closer to the man in the hoodie. I couldn't see his face. He was still turned away, his head tilted down. The weird part was, no one else was around. This was clearly a residential area, with rows of darkened houses and empty cars parked along the curb. But there wasn't a single light on anywhere. It looked like a ghost town, even though it was probably just past midnight, judging by the timestamp. Then, almost like he could sense he was being watched, the man turned around, and I swear to you, I felt my stomach drop. His face, it wasn't right. It was like he'd been in an accident or something. His skin was too pale, and his eyes, they were unnaturally wide, staring right at the camera with a look that felt too intense, too focused, like he could see right through the lens. He didn't say a word. He just stared. after what felt like forever, the camera turned away, and the person filming started running, the feed turning into a blur of dark streets and shaking visuals. The audio was picking up what sounded like panicked breathing, rapid and shallow, but it was hard to tell if it was the camera operator or something else. As they ran, the houses around them looked more and more run down, like they were fleeing deeper into some kind of abandoned part of town. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the stream cut out. I sat there, staring at the blank screen, wondering if my internet had crashed. But after a moment, the stream refreshed, and a message flashed across the screen. Stay tuned for the next live update. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some elaborate prank, maybe an art project, but there was something about it that felt too raw, too real. I told myself I'd check back tomorrow, just out of curiosity, to see if they'd post something else. Maybe it would be some kind of reveal, like, just kidding, and I'd laugh it off. I wish I'd listened to my gut and left it alone, but I didn't, and that was only the beginning. The next night, I was right back on that stream. I couldn't get it out of my head. There was something about it that didn't feel like the typical horror stuff I'd seen online. This felt like it had weight. It felt real. And yeah, maybe it sounds messed up, but I wanted to see more. I needed to know if it was legit or just some weird internet prank. I sat there, watching the loading screen, waiting. Finally, the stream flickered to life. This time, there were two people on screen, two men. They were talking in hushed voices, looking around nervously. They were standing outside what looked like an old fenced-off building. It was one of those massive, abandoned warehouses, the kind with shattered windows and graffiti all over the walls. The area around it looked deserted, like no one had been there in years. But the men looked tense, like they were somewhere they weren't supposed to be. One of the men was holding the camera, and the other was holding some kind of flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of the cracked pavement and broken glass. They kept glancing over their shoulders, and I got this gut feeling that they weren't just scared of getting caught by security. It was like they were afraid of something else entirely, something I couldn't see. They stopped in front of a heavy, rusted door, the kind that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. One of them whispered something I couldn't quite catch, and then, with a shuddering breath, he reached out and pulled the door open. The creak was low and guttural, echoing in the empty night, and as soon as the door swung wide, the flashlight caught something strange. Just inside, there was a narrow hallway, and lining the walls were photographs, thousands of them, pasted up in haphazard rows, covering every inch of the walls. The camera zoomed in, and I realized with a jolt that they weren't just random photos. They were portraits, faces, hundreds, maybe thousands of faces, all staring blankly out from the walls. Some looked recent, clear and high resolution, but others were old, black and white, faded and worn. The camera held on one for a second, and I felt a chill. The face was a woman, young, maybe in her 20s. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her mouth slightly open like she'd been caught mid-scream. And beneath her photo, scrawled in what looked like smudged red ink, was a single word: watch. The men didn't say anything. They just moved deeper into the building, shining the flashlight on more of those faces as they went. The photos lined the walls all the way down the hallway, leading into an open space that looked like it used to be some kind of factory floor. Machinery stood rusted and broken, casting long shadows across the concrete. Then the camera picked up something else, a noise, faint but distinct, like a low hum. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the building. The men stopped, exchanged a look, and then started moving toward it, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. The sound grew louder as they went, a steady, pulsing thrum that seemed to fill the air, making it feel thick, heavy. The camera caught another glimpse of something on the wall, a set of handprints, smeared and faded, leading down a side corridor. They were small, almost childlike, and the sight of them made my skin crawl. The men hesitated, and for a second, I thought they were going to turn back. But then, the one holding the flashlight whispered, "We've come this far," and they pushed on. As they moved deeper, the humming noise got louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't just a machine or some kind of generator. It sounded organic, like something alive, something breathing. They rounded a corner, and there, in the center of the room, was a single, dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering like it was about to burn out. Beneath it was a chair, an old, rusty chair, the kind you'd see in a doctor's office from the 1950s, and strapped to the chair was a person. I couldn't tell much from the way the camera was positioned, but I could see enough to know it wasn't right. The person was slumped forward, their head hanging low, face obscured by tangled dark hair. Their skin was pale, almost waxy, like they'd been there for a long time. The men didn't speak. They just stood there, frozen, as the humming noise grew louder, almost drowning out the rapid breathing from the guy holding the camera. Then, slowly, the person in the chair lifted their head. I'll never forget what I saw next. Their face was distorted, like literally distorted, the way a face might look in a funhouse mirror. The eyes were too large, too round, and their mouth stretched into an unnatural smile that looked like it hurt. They didn't move, didn't speak, but those eyes, they fixed on the camera, staring unblinkingly, like they could see through the screen, like they could see me. And then, from somewhere behind the camera, a voice whispered, low and raspy, almost like a hiss, "You shouldn't have come here." The stream cut out, plunging my room into darkness. I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the screen as it went black, wondering if I'd actually just seen what I thought I had. The last image burned into my mind, the eyes, wide and too round, staring right at me. I didn't know if I was going to check back for another stream, or if I was ever going to sleep again. But I was sure of one thing. This wasn't a prank, and whoever was behind this, they wanted people to see something. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face staring back at me, distorted, twisted in that unnatural grin that didn't look human. It was like the image had burned itself into my mind. I kept telling myself it was just a creepy video, probably staged, some elaborate internet project or an ARG. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, there was this deep, unsettling feeling gnawing at me that I couldn't shake. The next day, I was jittery, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. Every little sound made me jump, and by the time night rolled around, I was exhausted. I knew I should have just let it go, pretended I'd never seen that stream, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. Something about it felt like a puzzle that I needed to solve, like the more I understood, the less terrifying it would become. So, against every instinct telling me to just forget it, I logged onto Undercurrent again. This time, the stream was already live, and the screen was different. There was no shaky camera, no empty buildings. It was just a still shot, like security footage, showing a room that looked oddly familiar. It took me a few seconds to place it, but when I did, my blood ran cold. It was the same room with the chair, the one from last night's stream. Only now, the room was empty, the chair left vacant in the middle of the floor, like whatever had been there was gone. I stared at the screen, barely breathing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The room was dead silent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my fingers trembling as I gripped the edge of my desk. And then, after what felt like an eternity, a door in the background creaked open. Slowly, the figure of a man stepped into view, but his back was to the camera, his face hidden. He walked with a strange, jerky gait, like his limbs didn't quite fit together right. He stopped just short of the chair and stood there, perfectly still, his head slightly tilted, as if he was listening for something. For a moment, the only sound was a faint crackling, like static, coming from the speakers. Then, without warning, he turned around. The face was different from the one in the chair last night, but it had the same sickly wrongness to it. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his mouth stretched into a smile that looked forced, like someone had pulled it back with invisible strings. But what made my stomach twist was the feeling behind it. There was no expression in his eyes, no trace of emotion. It was like looking at an empty shell, a puppet pretending to be human. He stared directly into the camera, unblinking, and I couldn't shake the sensation that he could see me just as clearly as I could see him. Suddenly, the static grew louder, almost deafening, and the camera started to glitch. Lines flickered across the screen, distorting the image, making it hard to see. But through the distortion, I caught a glimpse of something else, just for a second. There, in the background, barely visible, was another figure. Smaller, hunched over, hidden in the shadows. I squinted, trying to make it out, but before I could get a clear look, the screen froze, and the distorted man was gone. The room was empty again. Then, as the static faded, words started to appear on the screen, typed out one letter at a time in bold, white text. Tomorrow night, stay tuned for the final reveal. The words lingered on the screen for a few moments, and then the stream cut out, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the blackness. I sat there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. What did they mean by final reveal? Was it some kind of hint? A warning? And that wasn't even the strangest part. When I checked the time on the stream, it hadn't shown the usual timestamp. There were no numbers, no location, nothing that could give me any clue as to where this was happening. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I'd stumbled into something that was never meant to be seen. Something dark, twisted, and far too real. But I couldn't shake the curiosity. I needed to know what would happen next, even if it scared the hell out of me. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside, just beyond my line of sight, waiting. I kept hearing strange noises, little taps, creaks, things that felt out of place. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was letting the stream mess with my head, but that didn't stop me from lying awake, staring at the ceiling, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, I felt like a wreck, but I knew I'd tune in again that night. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a compulsion I couldn't resist. Whatever undercurrent was, I was hooked, like it had reached into my mind and planted a seed that I couldn't shake. And despite everything I'd seen, every instinct screaming at me to stop, I knew I'd be there at midnight, watching for the final reveal. Midnight came faster than I wanted it to. I'd been counting down the hours, anxiety gnawing at me. But by the time I opened the undercurrent site again, that anticipation had morphed into full-blown dread. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling like I was about to cross a line I couldn't come back from. The stream was live. This time, there was no loading screen, no delay. It just opened right into another dark room, but it wasn't empty. There were people in this one, 4 of them, standing in a loose semicircle, all facing the camera. They didn't move, didn't speak, and just like the others I'd seen, there was something wrong with their faces. They looked stretched, exaggerated, like they'd been pulled into shapes that defied any sense of normal human anatomy. Their eyes were too wide, their smiles too long, plastered across their faces like grotesque masks. Behind them, I could see a wall covered in those same photos I'd seen before. Rows and rows of faces, their blank expressions gazing out from the wall. Some looked young, some old, but they all shared that same emptiness, that hollow stare that made my skin crawl. And among them, taped right in the middle, was a photo that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a picture of the man from the first stream, the one standing in the middle of the road, staring at the camera. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward, closer to the camera. His movements were slow, jerky, like he was a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He stopped just inches from the lens, his wide, empty eyes staring directly into mine, and his mouth twisted into a grin that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. I felt my hands clench into fists as I watched, frozen, unable to look away. And then he spoke. His voice was low and raspy, almost like a whisper, but I could hear it clearly, each word chillingly precise. "You've seen too much," he said, and as the words left his lips, the others in the room began to move, shifting closer to the camera. Their eyes locked on me, their smiles widening. "You wanted the truth, didn't you?" he continued, his grin never faltering. I sat there, heart pounding, wondering if he was talking directly to me. It felt like he could see me, like he knew I was watching, even though I kept reminding myself that this was just a video feed. But as he stared into the camera, I swear I felt those eyes digging into me, like he was looking right through the screen. "We see everything," he whispered, his voice dripping with a kind of twisted delight. "All those little secrets, all those things you pretend to forget." And then slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something. It was small and square, but I couldn't make out what it was at first. He held it up to the camera, and as it came into focus, my stomach dropped. It was a photo, but not just any photo. It was my photo, a recent one too, one I didn't even remember taking. I was sitting at my desk, just like I was now, staring at my computer screen with that same look of horrified curiosity. My surroundings in the picture matched my room perfectly. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. How did they get this? How were they watching me? The man's grin stretched wider, as if he could feel my panic through the screen. "You're one of us now," he said, and behind him, the other figures began to chant in low, guttural voices. I couldn't make out the words at first. It was more of a hum, a dark, rhythmic sound that felt like it was drilling into my skull. The chanting grew louder, filling the room, echoing through the speakers. My head started to pound, my vision blurring, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. As the chanting intensified, the screen started to glitch again, flickering with static, and for a brief moment, the camera shifted, showing me a different room. It was almost identical to the one I was sitting in. Same layout, same desk, even the same chair. And sitting in that chair was me, or something that looked like me, with the same vacant stare, the same empty expression I'd seen on those other faces. I felt like I was going to be sick. The me on screen lifted its head, locking eyes with the camera, and I felt a sharp, visceral terror that I'd never felt before. This wasn't just a video feed. This was something else, something beyond what I could understand. The image flickered back to the man holding my photo, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. "We're always watching," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chanting. "And now, so are you." The screen cut to black, the chanting replaced by silence, and for a second, I thought it was over. But then a final message appeared, typed out in that same slow crawl across the screen. "This is your invitation." I sat there shaking, staring at the message, the weight of what I'd just seen sinking in. They had my photo. They had a replica of my room. They were watching me, and somehow they wanted me to be part of whatever this was. But the screen didn't go black. The message lingered, and then something else appeared. My address, typed out in that same white text, like a final confirmation that there was no escape. The message faded, replaced by one last line. "Tomorrow, we'll be with you." And then the stream ended. I sat there paralyzed, barely able to breathe, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get up, to run, to do something. But all I could do was sit there, staring at the empty screen, feeling like the walls were closing in. I didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow, but one thing was certain. I wasn't alone anymore. I barely moved from my desk. Hours blurred into each other as I sat there, my mind running in circles, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Every sound outside, footsteps, a car door, even the creak of my apartment settling, felt like a warning. I kept looking at the clock, counting down to midnight, terrified of what would happen once it came. I don't know what I expected. Maybe for someone to knock on my door, or worse, just appear in my room, those twisted faces and wide, empty eyes staring down at me. I kept refreshing the undercurrent site, even though I knew it wouldn't be live again until tonight. It was like I was caught in a loop, waiting for the inevitable. Finally, it was close to midnight, and I couldn't take the silence anymore. I went to the kitchen, trying to distract myself by making tea, something to keep my hands busy, anything to make me feel like I was still in control. But as I poured the water, I heard it, a low, steady hum, just like the one from the streams, coming from somewhere close by. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a product of my paranoia, but as I walked closer to the front door, it grew louder. The hum vibrated through the walls, deep and unsettling, like it was alive. I stared at the door, holding my breath, waiting to hear something on the other side. But nothing came, just that constant, pulsing hum, vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat. And then, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a notification from an unknown number. I hesitated, but I couldn't ignore it. I swiped it open, and a single message stared back at me. "Come to the window." Every instinct I had screamed at me to ignore it, but my legs moved on their own. I crossed the room slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last, until I was standing in front of the window. I pushed back the curtain just a fraction, barely daring to look, and there, just across the street, was a single figure standing under the streetlight, their face obscured by the shadows. My heart pounded as I realized they were staring right at me. Their head was tilted slightly, as if they were studying me, waiting. I couldn't make out their face, but there was something wrong about their posture, the way they stood so still, so perfectly unmoving. And then, in one swift motion, they raised a hand and waved. The light above them flickered, casting their face into brief, sharp relief, and I nearly stumbled back. It was the same distorted grin, the wide, unblinking eyes that I'd seen on the stream. They held my gaze for a moment, their smile stretching further, almost impossibly wide. And then, as quickly as they'd appeared, they turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing around the corner. I closed the curtain, breathing hard, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just seen what I'd seen. But before I could process it, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the same number. "We're inside." A chill ran down my spine. I forced myself to look around, scanning every shadow in the room, every corner, convinced that something would be standing there, waiting. But everything was still, eerily silent. I backed up against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just another trick, something to scare me into believing they were closer than they really were. But then I heard it, the hum, louder this time, coming from my bedroom. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The hum grew louder, a pulsing, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo off the walls. And as I crept toward the bedroom, I felt like I was walking straight into a nightmare. The door was open just a crack, and through the gap, I could see a faint, flickering light. I nudged the door open slowly, and what I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the room, was a small old television, one of those ancient boxy models with a grainy screen. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of that. And on the screen, frozen in grainy black and white footage, was my own room. It was live, the exact same angle from where I was standing. I could see myself reflected back, standing in the doorway, staring in disbelief. Then, the image shifted, and I saw something else. Behind me, in the reflection, a figure was standing just out of frame, half hidden by the shadows. I whipped around, but there was no one there, just empty space. I looked back at the screen, and the figure was still there, closer now, moving toward me with that same unnatural, jerky gait. My heart pounded as I backed away, inching toward the door, but no matter where I moved, the figure got closer, its eyes widening, that smile stretching into something that didn't look like it should belong on a human face. And then, just as it reached the screen, it stopped. Its face filled the camera, its eyes so close, I felt like I could see straight through them, into some dark, endless void. The hum grew louder, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the walls, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as those empty eyes locked onto me. Finally, the figure on screen mouthed something, so slow, so deliberate, that it made my skin crawl. "You're one of us now." The screen cut to black, the hum vanished, and in the silence that followed, my phone buzzed one last time. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and stared at the final message. "Welcome to Undercurrent." The message disappeared, leaving my phone blank, as if it had never been there at all. I looked around my empty room, feeling that same chill seep into my bones, like something was watching me, waiting just beyond my line of sight. And even though I was alone, I felt it, that heavy, oppressive presence lingering in the air. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't slept much since. Every time I close my eyes, I see those faces, that twisted grin, those eyes that looked straight into me. I don't go to the window anymore. I don't even check the undercurrent sight. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, a faint, distant hum, pulsing through the walls, like a heartbeat. And somehow, I know they're still watching. I paid to join a dark web conspiracy forum about the New World Order. Now my phone won't stop recording me. Alright, so I know this is going to sound like one of those ridiculous don't go on the dark web horror stories, but I swear to you, I never expected it to turn out like this. To be fair, I've always had this weird obsession with conspiracy theories. Aliens, cryptids, government cover-ups, the works. I'd seen enough people in tinfoil hats rambling on about the New World Order on YouTube to get curious. At first, it was all fun and games, just watching videos in my downtime. But then, I wanted more. I wanted to see if there was any truth to it, or if it was all just people losing their minds over nothing. One night, after too many hours of mindless browsing, I found myself on a conspiracy forum. Typical stuff. Threads on lizard people, secret bunkers, mind control, and the classic shadow government paranoia. But then, buried among the usual nonsense, there was this one link that caught my eye. It didn't have a title or anything, just a bunch of random numbers and letters. I clicked it, feeling like an idiot, but my curiosity was in full force. The page loaded slow, like really slow, and then there it was, a dark web forum dedicated to the New World Order. But this one wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. It was sleek, weirdly polished for something on the dark web, and every thread was locked behind a paywall. The kind of place that looked like it was designed to lure in people who think they know something no one else does. I should have taken that as a red flag and backed out, but nope, I was all in. A small pop-up told me the entry fee was $50 in Bitcoin. Now, I know what you're thinking. Who in their right mind would pay $50 to access some shady website that's probably just spouting the same stuff you can find on YouTube for free? But it was late, and I was curious, so I figured, why not? I had a little Bitcoin stashed away from a friend who got me into crypto, so I paid the fee. Once the payment went through, the locked threads opened up one by one. The first few posts were as bizarre as you'd expect, like people just spiraling about hidden symbols on the dollar bill, or evidence of mind control in pop music. But the more I scrolled, the more I noticed something off. Unlike the forums I'd seen before, this one didn't just talk about theories. It had instructions, posts detailing specific steps on how to protect yourself from their surveillance, recipes for homemade anti-tracking devices, and lists of safe zones to hide in if you thought someone was watching you. There were diagrams, coordinates, even links to encrypted files. Like this was all real. Now, I'm not saying I believed it right away, but it was convincing enough to keep me reading. The posts were detailed, written like tutorials on how to disconnect from government tracking and avoid detection. A couple of users even posted screenshots that looked like actual government documents with blacked out lines. And these weren't your average dark web users either. The names were anonymous, but their tone was weirdly professional. It gave me the chills, honestly. But I kept reading. After a few hours of scrolling, I came across this thread called Eyes and Ears. It had over 100 replies, and every one of them was tagged with a red, high-risk warning label. The opening post was simple, just 2 sentences. Your phone is never off. Your microphone is never silent. The responses were all about how to protect yourself from silent tracking, with people claiming that even airplane mode wasn't enough to keep your phone from spying on you. A bunch of users had posted what they called evidence, saying that any smartphone manufactured in the last 10 years has built-in government backdoors. There were steps for turning off certain settings, links to software that supposedly blocked surveillance, and lots of cryptic comments about some program called Constant Sentinel. Apparently, it was this hidden app the government used to monitor the unaware. Again, part of me was like, okay, yeah, right. But another part of me was just unnerved enough that I started checking my phone. I looked at the battery stats, the app data, anything that might show something weird running in the background. And that's when I noticed something. Under the permissions tab, there was a little red dot next to microphone. I clicked it, and my phone told me there was an app currently using it, but it wouldn't tell me which one. I tried checking the settings for each app one by one, but nothing was listed as active. It was like the microphone was on, but invisible. And I swear to you, I had this creeping sensation that I was being watched. Like, as stupid as it sounds, I felt seen. At this point, it was past midnight, and I figured I'd just call it a night, clear my head, maybe try again in the morning. But right as I closed the browser, I heard this soft click, like the sound a camera makes when it starts recording, the kind you only hear if the room is dead quiet. I froze. I glanced down at my phone, which was just sitting there on the desk, screen off, supposedly idle. But something about it felt wrong, like it was waiting for me to look away. Thinking I was losing it, I turned my phone off completely, and I mean off, holding down the button until the screen went black. For a second, I felt stupid for even caring about any of this. It was just a dark web rabbit hole, right? I tossed my phone on the bed and turned to go brush my teeth. But as soon as I took a step, I heard that faint click again, coming from behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, and my phone was on. The lock screen was up, like I'd just pressed the button to wake it. Only I hadn't touched it at all. That was enough for me. I decided to leave my phone in the kitchen, grab my laptop, and try to figure out what was going on. If I couldn't find anything weird in the settings, maybe a quick search online would calm me down. But when I opened my laptop, there was a message waiting for me on the screen. It wasn't an email, not a chat notification, just a plain text file titled listening.txt. Against every instinct telling me to just close the laptop and go to sleep, I clicked on it. It was blank at first, just a blinking cursor. But then, right in front of me, letters started typing themselves out. The cursor blinked once, twice, then started typing by itself. I watched, heart pounding, as words appeared on the screen, one slow letter at a time. You shouldn't have looked. I sat there, my hands frozen above the keyboard. It felt like the room had dropped 10 degrees, and every nerve in my body was on edge. Rationally, I knew there was probably some weird remote access thing going on. Maybe I downloaded a virus from that forum, or clicked a bad link. But every logical thought kept getting pushed aside by this creeping feeling of dread. This wasn't like any hack I'd ever seen. It felt personal. Before I could even think of a response, more words appeared. It's too late now. They're watching you. I tried to close the file, but my mouse wasn't responding. The cursor stayed exactly where it was, locked in place. The text on the screen continued to fill, each word pushing a chill deeper into my bones. Your phone isn't off. It's never off. That was when I heard it again. A faint click from the other room, like something shifting in the dark. My phone was still on the kitchen counter where I'd left it, but it felt like it was calling to me, daring me to come back. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow it knew I was sitting here, staring at this message. My first instinct was to grab my laptop and run outside. Maybe it was just some paranoid part of me, but it felt like the walls were closing in, like my apartment had eyes. But I stayed put, hypnotized by the message on the screen. I watched as new lines appeared, one after the other. You paid to be here. You asked to know. Now we'll ask you, do you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem? There was no context, no explanation, just that cryptic line. I didn't even understand what it meant, but I knew this was no ordinary prank. Someone or something was messing with me. Badly. I finally managed to unfreeze my hands and slammed my laptop shut, hoping that would stop whatever was happening. For a few seconds, I sat there in silence, trying to convince myself that none of this was real. Maybe I was just overtired. Maybe it was all some glitch or elaborate hoax. But then, out of nowhere, my laptop chimed. I opened it, only to find a new message flashing across the screen. Answer the question. This time, it wasn't just text. An audio recording had started playing in the background, muffled but distinct. At first it sounded like white noise, but then I heard a voice. It was faint, like someone whispering from far away and barely audible, but the words were unmistakable. Your room. Right now. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My bedroom door was wide open, leading into the dark hallway. Every instinct I had was screaming to turn on every light in the house, maybe even call someone just to feel a little less alone. But that voice, it sounded like it was coming from my own apartment, as if someone was standing just out of sight, waiting for me. I forced myself to stand up, inching toward the bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. When I got to the doorway, I flipped the light switch. The room lit up, empty and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But there was a new sound now, coming from my phone in the kitchen. It was ringing, a quiet, almost timid ringtone I'd never set. I walked over slowly, half expecting to see an unknown caller ID or something equally creepy. But there was no number, no contact, just a single word flashing on the screen. Answer. I stared at it, the phone screen bright and cold under my fingers. I shouldn't have picked it up. Every part of me knew that. But curiosity, that same dumb, reckless curiosity, got the best of me again. I tapped answer, bringing the phone to my ear. There was a pause, a few seconds of dead air, and then a voice. Not the whisper from before, but something rougher, like static mixed with human speech. The voice didn't sound entirely natural, almost like someone trying to mimic human tones, but just barely missing the mark. You're in too deep, it said, low and unsteady. They know you now. They see everything you see. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I couldn't even make sense of what I wanted to say. My mind was blank, frozen by the strange, distorted quality of the voice on the other end. It felt wrong, like it wasn't just a voice, but a presence, something bigger lurking behind it. Then the voice spoke again, softer this time, almost like a warning. Do not close your eyes. Before I could respond, the call disconnected. The screen went dark, and for a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at the phone like it might jump out of my hand. At that point, I wasn't sure what to do. Everything I'd read on that forum, all the threads and conspiracies, suddenly felt way too close to reality. This wasn't just some creepy story. It was happening to me, and I had no idea what to do about it. I wanted to believe it was just a hack or a prank, but something told me that wasn't the case. Not with the way my phone kept acting up, or that voice on the call, or the sense that something was in my room, watching. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, my laptop and phone turned off and shoved under a pillow, as if that would somehow keep them from listening. Every little sound made me jump. Pipes creaking, the fridge humming, even the wind outside. It all sounded amplified, like my senses were on high alert, waiting for something to happen. Around dawn, I finally dared to check my laptop again. The listening.txt file was still there, right on my desktop. But when I opened it, it was different. The text was gone, replaced by a single line at the bottom of the page. This is only the beginning. The text on the screen, "This is only the beginning," felt like a threat. It echoed in my mind, sinking in with a kind of cold finality. I shut the laptop, wanting to pretend it was just a dream. But I knew, deep down, I was far past that point. I tried to go about my morning like usual, thinking maybe if I just acted normal, this whole thing would blow over. I needed to get outside, clear my head, and convince myself I hadn't accidentally signed up for some kind of personal nightmare. So I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door, phone in my pocket, but deliberately off. I told myself I wouldn't touch it until I figured out what was going on. The air outside felt different, heavier somehow, like I was dragging something invisible with me. Paranoia crept in, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see someone following me. The streets were quiet, and every shadow felt like it was watching me, like I was suddenly part of something much bigger, darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment I paid that $50, I'd made myself a target. After wandering for a bit, I found myself in this little coffee shop near my apartment. It was early, so there were only a few people around. I got myself a coffee and sat in the corner, trying to figure out my next move. Maybe I could call someone, like a tech-savvy friend or a hacker who could take a look at my laptop and tell me I'd fallen for some elaborate prank. But before I could even take a sip, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I hadn't turned it back on. I was sure of it. I pulled it out, feeling my stomach sink. The screen was on, and there was a notification at the top that simply read, "Listening." I stared at it, hands trembling, then tried to swipe it away, but the phone wasn't responding. The notification stayed right there, unmoving, almost like it was burned into the screen. As I sat there, panicking and trying to make sense of it, my phone's camera app opened by itself. The front camera clicked on, and suddenly, I was staring at my own terrified face, watching myself in real time. It was like the phone was forcing me to confront the fact that something was looking back at me. I covered the camera with my hand, but that only made it worse. The camera app flicked over to the rear camera, now pointed at the quiet coffee shop around me. I watched on the screen as it captured everything in its view: the barista, the customers, even the door. And then, to my horror, the camera started zooming in, focusing on each person for a few seconds before moving to the next. It felt deliberate, like whoever was watching was choosing targets, marking them. And then it stopped on this one guy in a suit, sitting a few tables away from me. The camera lingered on him, zooming in closer until his face filled the screen. And that's when I saw it. This small, almost invisible earpiece in his left ear. I wouldn't have noticed it if the camera hadn't zoomed in so close. The guy had been sitting there the whole time, staring at his coffee, not looking at anyone. But the second I noticed the earpiece, he looked up, directly at me. He held my gaze for a few seconds, his expression unreadable. And then slowly, he raised his hand to his ear, tapping the earpiece twice. My phone vibrated again, and this time, it was a message notification. The sender was just a long string of random numbers, no name, no contact. I opened the message with shaking hands. It was a single line of text. Do not look at them. I looked up again, but the guy in the suit was gone. Just gone, like he disappeared the moment I'd looked away. I scanned the shop, but there was no sign of him. It was like he'd never been there at all, leaving only that chilling message on my phone. My pulse was racing. I didn't even know who they were, but it was clear that someone, or something, was giving me instructions. The worst part? A part of me felt like I needed to follow them, like my life depended on it. I left the coffee shop as fast as I could, practically running down the street. My phone was still in my hand, the screen on, camera active, capturing everything around me as I walked. No matter what I did, I couldn't turn it off, couldn't force it to stop recording. It felt like the phone had a mind of its own now, documenting my every step. The notifications kept coming. Every few minutes, a new message would appear, always from that same number. They see you. Do not speak to anyone. Trust no one. At one point, I passed by a group of people waiting at a bus stop, and as I walked by, one of them, a woman with dark sunglasses and a gray hoodie, glanced at me and tapped her ear, just like the man in the coffee shop. Another notification buzzed. Keep moving. I broke into a sprint, barely aware of where I was going. I just needed to get away, find somewhere safe, somewhere they couldn't track me. But then I realized there was nowhere safe. I'd paid to access that forum, given my information freely. I'd practically handed them the keys to my entire life. I finally ducked into an alley, pressing my back against the wall, breathing heavily. I held the phone in front of me, the camera still open, capturing the empty alleyway, the shadows cast by the dim morning light. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe I thought that if I hid, this whole thing would somehow stop. But as I stood there, the screen started glitching, flickering with static like an old TV. I thought maybe it was finally breaking down, but then, in between the glitches, I saw something. Faces of people, like they were looking straight into the screen. Dozens of them, all distorted and warped by the static. Some of them had hollow, dark eyes. Others were grinning with twisted smiles, and all of them seemed to be looking at me, watching, waiting. Then, through the noise and static, a new message appeared, bold and bright against the dark. You are part of the network now. And with that, the camera turned off, and my phone went silent. The only thing left on the screen was that single phrase, burned into the background like it was part of the phone itself. You are part of the network now. I felt a wave of dread crash over me. Whatever I'd stumbled into, whatever I'd paid for, this wasn't just some conspiracy theory or dark web prank. I'd joined something far more real than I'd ever intended, and now I couldn't leave. I stumbled back to my apartment, every step feeling heavier, like I was carrying the weight of all those faces I'd seen on my screen. The city felt empty, the streets too quiet, like it had been cleared out just for me to walk alone. It was only mid-morning, but the sky was overcast, casting this gray, lifeless hue over everything, perfectly fitting for the way I felt, honestly. Trapped, lost, like I was part of something way beyond my control. When I finally got inside, I double-locked the door and closed every curtain in the apartment, blocking out as much of the outside world as I could. I was trying to catch my breath, to think of what to do next, but all I could focus on was that phrase burned into my phone screen. You are part of the network now. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, staring at the screen. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone, or maybe something, looking back at me, like I was holding a direct link to whoever or whatever was behind this whole thing. My mind raced with questions. Was this network real? How could they see me? And what did they mean by part of the network? And then, without warning, the phone screen flickered back to life. A new app icon appeared, one I'd never seen before. It was just an eye, a simple, unblinking eye, black and hollow. No name, no description, just that ominous icon staring at me. Against every bit of common sense, I tapped on it. The app opened to a black screen with a single line of text across the top, initiating synchronization. Below it, a loading bar filled slowly, inch by inch, like it was savoring each second. I tried to exit, but the screen wouldn't respond, and the phone didn't even have a shutdown option anymore. I was locked into the app, forced to watch as it reached 100%. As soon as it did, my front camera turned on again, only this time, it wasn't just recording me. A grid of faces appeared on the screen. I recognized some of them instantly. The man from the coffee shop, the woman at the bus stop, even a few strangers I'd seen on the street that morning. They were all looking at me through the screen, their faces rigid, eyes fixed directly on the camera. And then, one by one, they began moving. Each face leaned closer to the camera, filling the screen with their hollow, empty stares. Their expressions were blank, but there was something deeply unsettling in their eyes, like they were just shells, like someone had hollowed them out and filled them with nothing but obedience. I could feel myself shaking, staring back at all these people, these members of the network. Suddenly, the screen switched to a live video feed. It was showing my apartment door, my own front door, captured from a low, hidden angle I couldn't place. It was like someone had planted a camera right outside my door, and now I was being forced to watch it. As I stared at the screen, I saw movement. A figure approaching my door, slowly, purposefully. The camera zoomed in, and I recognized him immediately. It was the man from the coffee shop, the one with the earpiece. He stood there, still and silent, as if waiting for me to do something. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed with a new message. Invite him in. I dropped the phone, backing away until I was pressed against the wall. My mind was racing, my instincts screaming at me to stay put, to lock every door and window and hide. But then, another notification flashed on my phone, more urgent this time. Invite him in, or they'll come to you. It was a threat, plain and simple. I didn't know who they were, but after everything I'd seen, I wasn't about to test it. I forced myself to pick up the phone and take a step toward the door, my heart pounding so hard It felt like it was going to explode. Slowly, I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking as I twisted it and pulled the door open. He was standing there, right in front of me, the same unreadable look on his face. Up close, he looked even stranger, like he was barely there, like his skin was too tight, his eyes a little too blank, his movements stiff and robotic. Without a word, he stepped inside, brushing past me as if he knew exactly where he was going. He walked straight into my living room, phone in hand, eyes fixed on the screen. I watched him for a moment, wondering if I should say something, if I should even try to stop him. But before I could decide, my phone buzzed again. Do not speak unless spoken to. So I stood there, silent, watching as this stranger made himself at home in my apartment. He tapped a few things on his phone, occasionally glancing around the room like he was scanning for something. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I kept my mouth shut. The warning from the network burned into my mind. After a few minutes, he looked up, finally locking eyes with me. There was something new in his gaze now, a kind of dark, unsettling intelligence that hadn't been there before. His lips twisted into a small, hollow smile. "Welcome to the network," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You have been chosen as a point of access." My mouth went dry, and I struggled to find words, but nothing came. He continued, as if he hadn't noticed my fear. "This device," he said, holding up his phone, "will monitor your compliance. Your cooperation ensures your safety. Non-compliance." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Then, without another word, he turned and left, shutting the door softly behind him. I stood there, trying to process what had just happened, feeling like I'd been dropped into some kind of nightmare. My phone vibrated once more. A final message from that nameless number. "Remember, you are now a node. Do not deviate." I sank onto the couch, staring at the screen, the weight of those words settling over me. A node. I didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but I had a horrible feeling it wasn't good. That's when I noticed the app icon had changed again. Instead of the eye, it now displayed a map. No names, no cities, just a blank grid with a single, pulsing dot in the center. It didn't take me long to realize that dot was me. The pulsing dot in the center of the screen was unmistakable. I stared at it, horrified, watching as it blinked, almost like it was breathing, alive. The screen zoomed out slightly, showing several other dots scattered across the map, none of them labeled, all of them moving at a slow, steady pace. I had no idea where these dots were, but I knew they were people, other nodes in this twisted network. My fingers hovered over the screen, itching to close the app, to do anything to escape this nightmare. But the warning from the man in my apartment, "You are a node, do not deviate," still hung heavy in my mind. My phone had become a constant reminder that there was no going back. I'd signed up for something I couldn't leave, not without consequences. I couldn't just sit there, so I did the only thing I could think of. I started looking for some kind of help. I checked the App Store, searched for any software that could block remote access, but every search result was a dead end. It was like my phone had been hijacked, its every function under control, completely locked down. Even my Wi-Fi settings were grayed out, inaccessible. I was cut off, trapped in my own home, with nothing but that pulsing dot on my screen. Then my phone buzzed again. It was another message, this time from a different string of random numbers. "Report to the nearest safe zone. GPS active. My heart sank. The app's map shifted, zooming in on a specific location just a few blocks away, a random building I'd never even noticed before. I had no choice. I grabbed my hoodie and left my apartment, shoving my phone into my pocket, but keeping it on, just to avoid setting off another notification. The streets felt different as I walked, like they'd become hostile territory, every passerby a potential node watching me. And the strange thing was, no one made eye contact with me. No one even looked in my direction, like I was invisible. When I reached the location, it was just a small abandoned storefront, the windows covered with years of grime and dust. But the GPS dot on my phone pulsed harder, like it was confirming I was in the right place. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The interior was as lifeless as the exterior. Bare walls, cracked linoleum floors, and a single fluorescent light flickering overhead. And then I saw them. A row of chairs lined up against the far wall, each one occupied by a person sitting perfectly still, heads bowed, their phones resting on their laps. They looked completely blank, like they'd been drained of everything that made them human, turned into living statues. I tried to back away, but my phone buzzed again, the message as simple as it was chilling. Sit. I knew better than to hesitate. I moved to the last empty chair, lowering myself slowly, feeling a strange sense of resignation wash over me. The moment I sat down, the fluorescent light flickered and shut off, plunging the room into near darkness. My phone screen was the only light, casting an eerie glow over the rows of faces, each of them lit up by their own devices. The silence was overwhelming, like we were in some kind of unspoken agreement, bound by the same invisible strings. And then, as if on cue, my phone screen changed. Words began typing themselves out, line by line, echoing through my mind. Welcome to the system. You are now connected. The network sees all. The network knows all. The screen blinked, and then a new interface loaded, filled with data streams and encrypted codes scrolling endlessly, as if I was staring into the heart of some massive, unstoppable machine. For the first time, I saw names, partial names, random IDs, all linked to locations, transactions, searches, private messages. It was a live feed of people's lives, their secrets, their private moments, all displayed like an open book. And then I realized I was one of them. My name, my location, even my searches for ways to break free. They were all there, logged in the system. The rows of people around me began to move, each of them raising their heads slowly, their eyes blank and distant, like they weren't seeing anything. But their phones were glowing, and I could feel this pulsing energy in the air, a collective connection, like we were all part of one massive mind. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, my phone spoke. Not in text, not in the strange, distorted voices from before, but in my own voice. It played back recordings of my conversations, my questions, my fears, my doubts, every word I'd spoken, every anxious whisper. It had all been recorded, catalogued, filed. It didn't end there. The phone began recording me in real time, broadcasting my heartbeat, the sound of my shallow breathing, the way my hands shook. And I knew, somehow, that everyone else in the room could hear it too, that they were all listening to my fear. Then the final message appeared, as if it were my new mantra, my new reality. You are no longer alone. And in that moment, I felt it, a presence, an awareness pressing in, filling every part of me, like I was being subsumed by the network itself. I was just a small piece now, a part of something vast, faceless, and inescapable. There was no more me, only the network. I felt myself slipping, my thoughts dissolving into the endless stream of data, becoming one with the system. The last thing I remember, just before my mind faded completely, was the sound of that same soft click. I downloaded a dark web app that predicts the next big sports scandal. It just sent me a warning about the Super Bowl. Alright, so before I get into this, I know how it sounds. Trust me, if I were reading this, I'd probably think it was complete nonsense too. But I promise you, this is real, and honestly, I wish it wasn't. I'm usually a pretty skeptical guy, the kind who laughs off ghost stories and thinks the deep web horror stories are mostly just that, stories. But here I am, typing this out because I can't stop thinking about what happened, and I feel like someone needs to hear it. Maybe if I get this out there, I can start to shake off the feeling that I'm being watched. I'm not a dark web junkie or anything. Like, I know enough to know it's out there and that there's a lot of shady stuff on it, but I've never really had a reason to dive in. It was my friend Josh who convinced me to check it out. We're both huge sports fans, right? Obsessed, really. We have this whole setup at home. Dual monitors, alerts for every game, and enough betting slips to wallpaper a room. Josh came over one night a few weeks ago, and he was just buzzing. He said he'd heard about this app on the dark web that predicts scandals before they happen. According to him, it was like some kind of combination of insider gossip and AI analysis, way beyond what any regular sports journalist could pull together. Of course, I was intrigued, but I also thought it sounded completely ridiculous. I mean, if an app could predict scandals, wouldn't people have heard about it? But Josh swore up and down that it was the real deal. He'd seen screenshots from a forum he follows, and there were rumors that this app had predicted that huge match-fixing scandal last year before it broke. I told him he was out of his mind, but he dared me to find it and try it out. So, in true sports bro fashion, I couldn't back down. I didn't even know where to start, but after enough time Googling and getting weird links sent to me by Josh, I finally found it. I felt my stomach twist a little as I hit download. The app didn't have a name, just a series of letters and numbers. It looked like some old school software from the 90s, like the kind of thing you'd see on an ancient, clunky Windows computer. No slick design or user-friendly layout, just a dark blank screen and a prompt for activation. When I got to that part, I almost bailed, but my curiosity and, let's be real, my ego got the better of me. I hit activate and the screen went black for a second. Then a message popped up. Welcome to Scout. Scandal tracking in progress. It was simple enough, but it felt ominous. The screen didn't do anything else. No icons, no options. Just scandal tracking in progress. Josh was hyped and practically glued to my side, waiting for something amazing to happen, but nothing else came up. I thought maybe it was a joke, or worse, malware. So we laughed it off, joked about our hacker adventure, and that was it. After an hour or so of watching a game, Josh left, and I forgot about the whole thing. At least, until the first notification came through. It was 3 days later, and I was in the middle of work when my phone buzzed. I glanced down, expecting a work email or something, but instead, it was a message from SCOUT, and it wasn't your usual notification either. It was almost like a command. Warning. Pay attention to the upcoming match. I actually laughed when I read it. This was the big secret app. Some cryptic, vague warning that could apply to any game. But it did catch my attention. It was just eerie enough to keep me curious. That night, I couldn't help myself. I tuned into the game it had apparently warned me about, and well, the game was normal for about half an hour. Then, it all went off the rails. One of the players on the home team just collapsed. It was terrifying. The announcers were scrambling, trying to figure out what had happened, and the cameras cut to a weird angle, almost like they didn't want to show what was going on. The medics rushed onto the field, but there was this awful, tense silence. No one knew what was going on, and the crowd was just dead quiet. Turns out, the guy had some kind of hidden heart condition no one knew about. His collapse was all over the news the next day, with doctors talking about how he was lucky to be alive. But here's the thing. The app had warned me. It wasn't a major scandal or anything, but it was weird, right? I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow this app knew. A few days went by, and I started to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was just a random guess. But then, a few days later, I got another message. Be alert. Next scandal in 48 hours. This time, I felt a chill. This was no vague message about paying attention. This was specific. It was calling it a scandal and giving a time frame. Now, I was really interested and a little freaked out. 2 days later, I got home, threw on the game that the notification had pointed me toward, and started watching. For the first half, it was completely normal. But then, right at halftime, the announcement came through. 2 players were being pulled from the game, pending investigation. By morning, it was all over the news. Both players had been caught with performance-enhancing drugs. Their careers, at least for now, were over. Now, this couldn't be a coincidence. No way. I didn't know what to do with the information, or who I'd even tell about it. But I knew one thing. Whatever this app was, it was real. And then, things got personal. I was lying in bed a few nights after the second notification, scrolling through my phone and just waiting to fall asleep, when I got another alert. But this time, the message was different. No cryptic warnings, no vague messages. This time, it was chillingly direct. Warning. Super Bowl approaching. Do not trust them. I sat up, staring at my phone. This wasn't some game or random match. It was the freaking Super Bowl. And the wording, do not trust them, made my skin crawl. After that Super Bowl warning, I couldn't sleep. I'd been hyped for the game all year. It was like the culmination of everything Josh and I had been following. But now, there was this dark cloud hanging over it. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing, just some creepy app trying to freak me out. But deep down, I had this gnawing feeling that whatever was coming was going to be bigger than just some player getting busted for cheating. When I saw Josh the next day, I casually brought it up. Didn't even mention the app, just threw out a, "You ever wonder if they're hiding stuff about the Super Bowl?" He shrugged it off, called me paranoid, and started spouting off stats and predictions. Normally, I'd be right there with him, debating plays, getting into that armchair coach mode. But this time, all I could think about was that warning. 2 days later, another message came through. This one was way too specific. The game is rigged. Do not engage. Now, I'm not exactly an angel, but I'm not a conspiracy theorist either. The Super Bowl? Rigged? That's the kind of stuff you laugh about over beers, the kind of joke you tell to piss off your buddy when his team loses. But reading it in that app, knowing it had already predicted some insane things, it wasn't funny at all. It felt wrong. like I was staring at something I was never supposed to know. I didn't know what to make of it. Do not engage. What was that supposed to mean? I wasn't playing in the Super Bowl. I was just watching it. The message almost felt like it was telling me to steer clear of the entire event. But that was ridiculous, right? What could happen from just watching a game? That night, I started researching, diving into forums and news articles about past sports scandals, match fixing, player bribes, inside deals. There was more to it than I'd ever thought. It was like opening a door to a whole world of sketchy deals that I'd been happily ignoring. There were countless rumors of big games being rigged, players being silenced, refs taking bribes. And yeah, a lot of it was just internet noise. But some of it was disturbingly credible. By now, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another scandal. It felt bigger, like some massive scheme lurking under the surface. The closer I looked, the more I realized that certain players had mysteriously dropped from games at critical times. Coaches had been fired without much explanation, right after huge losses. The pattern was subtle, almost impossible to see if you didn't know what you were looking for. But once you saw it, it was like the whole game was being puppeteered. Then, 3 days before the Super Bowl, I got another message from Scout. Their agenda is set. Don't interfere. My blood ran cold. This wasn't like the other messages. It felt personal, like it was warning me. But what could I do to interfere? I'm just a guy with an app. I told myself it was just words on a screen, some automated message. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew me somehow. That someone out there knew I'd been looking into all this. And that's when things got worse. Over the next day or so, I started getting random friend requests on my social media. Weird profiles with no pictures, no followers, just blank accounts. At first, I ignored it, figured it was spam, until one account sent me a message. Curiosity is dangerous. Stay silent. Now, I was seriously freaked out. I deleted the message and blocked the account, but the requests kept coming. Each one had some variation of the same warning. Stay silent. Stop looking. Don't interfere. I hadn't even done anything, but it was like they were somehow watching me, tracking my every move. I started feeling like someone was following me, like every time I looked over my shoulder, there'd be some faceless guy in the crowd, just waiting. Then, out of nowhere, Josh called me up, said he wanted to talk. When I picked up, his voice was weird, not his usual loud, joking tone. He sounded scared, maybe even a little guilty. I was still trying to process everything, so I agreed to meet him at our usual bar. When I got there, he was already at a corner booth, looking jumpy. As soon as I sat down, he leaned in close and asked if I'd gotten any weird messages lately. I almost laughed. Weird messages were pretty much my whole life now. But when I asked him why, he just shook his head and looked around, like he was worried someone was watching. Josh told me he'd found something online about the app. A guy on the forum who'd claimed to have used it said he'd been warned about some big event years ago. Apparently, this guy had ignored the warning, went to the game anyway, and vanished right after. Just gone. No trace, no explanation. People on the forum had all these theories. Some thought he'd just skipped town. Others said he'd been taken by them. When I asked who they were, Josh just gave me this look and said, "Dude, I don't know. That's just what they said on the forum." It felt like we were both in over our heads. Josh told me he'd deleted everything off his computer, wiped any trace of Scout. He was done with it. Said he didn't want to know what happened at the Super Bowl or any other game. He'd seen enough. And then he leaned in, looking dead serious, and said, "You should too, man. Forget about it. Just let it go." But I couldn't. I had this horrible, itching curiosity that wouldn't let me stop. I tried to brush it off, told him I'd think about it, but he could tell I was lying. He just shook his head and muttered something under his breath before heading out. I went home that night, trying to convince myself to delete the app, but I just couldn't. There was something about it that felt like unfinished business, like I had to see it through, even if I didn't like where it was going. The next night, I got another message, but this one was different. It wasn't from Scout. It was just a random text from an unknown number. "You've been warned. Delete the app or face the consequences." I stared at the message, heart pounding. I didn't know what consequences they were talking about, but I knew they weren't bluffing. Still, I didn't delete it. I knew I should, but I couldn't help myself. It was like I was tethered to this thing, pulled deeper by something I didn't understand. Then, at exactly midnight, Scout sent me one final message. "You were given a choice. Prepare for the game." And then the screen went black. The app shut down, and when I tried to reopen it, it wouldn't load. I restarted my phone, thinking maybe it was a glitch, but it was gone, like it had never existed. Now, with the Super Bowl just hours away, I can't shake this feeling that something's coming. The day of the Super Bowl felt off right from the start. I woke up with this gnawing sense of dread, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting to pounce. I tried to shake it off, convince myself that it was just nerves from the app's weird messages, but that didn't work. I knew that I couldn't just pretend this was a regular game day. There was a darkness hanging over it, and no matter how many times I told myself I was being paranoid, I couldn't shake it. I tried texting Josh just to check in. No response. I called him, but it went straight to voicemail. Normally, I'd brush it off. Maybe he'd gone off-grid for the day, wanted to avoid the app and everything that came with it. But there was something uneasy about it. Josh wasn't the type to just vanish, especially not on the biggest day of the year for us. We'd been planning to watch the game together for months, and now he was just gone. I tried to distract myself by heading out to grab some snacks and drinks, the usual setup for our game day ritual. But as I was driving, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, there was this black SUV that seemed to linger a little too long. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was seeing things because of all the warnings from Scout and those creepy texts. But as I turned into different streets, the SUV stayed right behind me, always keeping its distance, but never out of sight. I was starting to freak out, thinking of ways to lose them, when suddenly they just stopped. 1 minute they were there, tailing me, and the next they were gone. I told myself to calm down, to focus on the game, and forget about all of this, but that was easier said than done. When I finally got back home, there was a message waiting on my phone. It was from Josh's number, but something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't in his style at all. No emojis, no abbreviations, just a short, cold message. "Meet me at 5th and Grand." Alone. It didn't make sense. Why would Josh be waiting for me downtown just hours before the game, and alone? The whole thing reeked of trouble, but part of me felt like I didn't have a choice. If Josh was in trouble, If something had happened because of Scout, I needed to know. I got to Fifth and Grand right as the sun was setting. It was a weird part of town, mostly deserted on Sundays, and there was this strange quiet that hung in the air. No traffic, no people, just this eerie silence. I scanned the area, half expecting to see Josh, but there was no one, just the empty street, washed in the cold, fading light. Then my phone buzzed. Another text from Josh's number. "You're too late. Leave now." I froze, trying to make sense of it. Too late? For what? Was this a trap? Was someone messing with me? I looked around, feeling more exposed by the second. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave without figuring out what was going on. That's when I heard it. A faint, metallic clicking sound from somewhere nearby. It was steady, almost rhythmic, and getting closer. I whipped around, scanning the street, but couldn't see anyone. The sound was echoing off the buildings, impossible to pinpoint. I was about to head back to my car when my phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't from Josh. It was from SCOUT. "You've been warned. Proceed to the game at your own risk." The message hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever Scout was, whoever was behind it, they knew I was here, knew I'd been looking into all this. It wasn't just some creepy AI predicting scandals. This felt personal, like someone had been tracking me, watching my every move. And the worst part? I had no idea who or why. I didn't wait around. I got in my car and sped home, half expecting that black SUV to reappear any second. But nothing happened. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet. By the time I got back, the Super Bowl was just about to start, but I was too rattled to enjoy any of it. I locked my doors, pulled down the blinds, and sat in front of my TV, every muscle tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The game kicked off, and for a while, it was completely normal. I almost started to relax, telling myself that maybe I'd overreacted. But about an hour in, just after halftime, I got another text. "Final warning. Turn off the broadcast." I stared at the screen, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. Turn off the broadcast? Why? Was something about to happen? I thought about ignoring it, just to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But that gnawing, instinctual fear stopped me. I turned off the TV, and the second I did, my phone buzzed again. Good choice. The message felt like a trap door closing beneath me. It was confirmation that someone, somewhere, knew exactly what I was doing. I sat there in silence, my mind spinning, my hands trembling, and then I heard something outside. This steady, quiet thudding, like footsteps. I rushed to the window, but all I could see was a shadow moving past. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the footsteps just faded away into the night. An hour later, I couldn't resist. I turned the game back on, just to see if anything had happened. The screen was static. I tried changing the channel, but it was all the same, pure static, like the signal had been cut. I checked my phone, tried streaming it there, but it wouldn't load. My Wi-Fi was fine. Every other site worked, but every feed of the Super Bowl was just gone. The worst part, when I checked the forums the next morning, I found out that the game had gone off air for exactly 15 minutes. Every network, every stream, all blacked out at the same time. But no one had a solid explanation. The league blamed a technical glitch and moved on, but people were buzzing with theories. Some said it was a power surge. Others thought it was a cyber attack. But a few people, People who seemed to know way more than they should said it wasn't an accident, that something had happened in those 15 minutes, something that they didn't want the world to see. Now, I can't stop wondering what I missed. The blackout during the game wasn't something I could shake off. I tried to convince myself that it was just a glitch, something normal, but it didn't add up. I'd seen a few technical difficulties during games before, but nothing like this. Not a complete blackout across every network and streaming service. Not for 15 whole minutes. It felt like something huge had happened, like there was a secret behind that static that I wasn't supposed to see. The forums went wild the next day. People were throwing out theories like wildfire. Some were just conspiracy junkies, but others sounded too convincing. A few posts stood out. They talked about seeing something just before the screens went dark. Strange blips in the broadcast, weird shadows on the field, movement that didn't match the players' positions. I rewatched the clips, trying to spot what they were talking about, but no one had clean footage. All anyone had was static and speculation. And then, buried deep in one of the threads, I found a post from a user called Touchdown Ghost. No profile picture, no posting history, just this one message. You weren't supposed to watch the game. You don't know what they took from you. My stomach twisted as I read it. I stared at the screen, reading the post over and over, trying to figure out what it meant. What they took from me. How could anyone take something from me through a screen? I was just a guy watching the game at home. There was no way that 50 minutes of static could have any real effect on me. Right? But then I started thinking back to everything that had happened since I downloaded that app. The cryptic warnings, the messages to not engage, the eerie footsteps outside my house. It was like they were building up to something, like this blackout was the grand finale of some twisted plan. And now, I couldn't stop wondering if maybe Scout, or whoever was behind it, knew exactly what they'd been leading me toward. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see flashes of static, hear that low hum from the blackout, like it was burrowing into my brain. I woke up in a cold sweat around 3 a.m, convinced I'd heard something outside again. I sat up in bed, listening, straining to catch any hint of sound. And then I heard it. A faint rustling, like someone shifting just outside my window. I crept over, my heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain, just an inch. And there, standing across the street, was a figure, barely visible in the shadows. They were just standing there, still as stone, watching my house. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no features, just a silhouette. For what felt like hours, we stood there, locked in this silent stare-off, until they finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. After that, I didn't bother going back to bed. I just sat in my living room, staring at the empty street, waiting for them to come back. But they didn't. And by the time morning came, I felt like I was losing my mind. Every sound, every shadow, felt like it was hiding something. But it wasn't until the next day that things got even weirder. I got a call from Josh's number. Finally, I almost didn't answer, thinking it was another one of those cryptic texts. But when I picked up, it was silence. No breathing, no background noise, just dead air. I said his name a few times, practically begging him to answer, but there was nothing. And then, after what felt like an eternity, a voice finally came through. But it wasn't Josh. It was low, almost mechanical, like someone was speaking through a voice changer. I could barely make out the words, but I managed to catch one phrase before the line went dead. They're watching. They've always been watching. My blood ran cold. The call had come from Josh's number, but there was no way that was him. I didn't know who it was, or how they'd gotten his number, but it was clear they wanted me to know I wasn't alone. That whatever had started with Scout had spiraled way beyond my control. The whole day, I kept expecting someone to show up at my door to confront me, but no one did. Just more static messages, more strange posts from Touchdown Ghost, talking about the truth and the blackout. I couldn't escape it. It was like every part of my life was being slowly swallowed by this app, by the warnings and the fear it had unleashed. Then, just as I was getting ready to delete every trace of Scout, I got one final message. This one didn't have any words. It was just a single image, a distorted, pixelated shot of the field during the blackout, with what looked like a shadow standing on the sidelines. It was hard to make out, but I could swear it was the same figure I'd seen outside my house, the same shadow that had been lurking in the background of every warning, and underneath the image was a single line of text. See you soon. That was it. I stared at that message. See you soon, and felt like I was slipping into some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do, who to call, or even if there was anyone I could trust. I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was all just some game, some elaborate prank. Whoever was behind this wasn't just messing with me anymore. They were closing in, and I had a horrible feeling that they had a plan, and that I was somehow a part of it. The next day, I tried to go about my routine, hoping that acting normal would break whatever spell this had cast over me. But it didn't help. Everywhere I looked, I saw shadows, people with their heads down, walking too close, glancing my way as if they knew something I didn't. I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid, or if these were the people from the messages, keeping an eye on me, waiting for me to slip up. Late that night, just as I was about to turn in, my phone buzzed with a notification from Scout. But this time, it wasn't a cryptic message. It was a link, just a bare link, with no other context. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. I knew that clicking it was probably the worst thing I could do, but my curiosity, that same gnawing, insatiable curiosity that had started this whole mess, took over. I tapped the link. It opened to a live feed. The camera was shaky, the quality terrible, like it was being filmed on some old beat-up phone. The scene was dark, hard to make out, but as the camera adjusted, I realized it was showing the inside of a small, empty room. My breath caught when I recognized the place. It was my friend Josh's apartment. The camera panned slowly, deliberately, over the empty living room, the overturned coffee table, and a smashed TV lying on the floor. I felt sick, watching this eerie, silent footage of my friend's place, looking like it had been torn apart by something or someone. The camera moved down a dark hallway, pausing just outside his bedroom. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. And then, the door creaked open, and the camera slid inside. The room was empty, except for a shadowy figure sitting on the bed, hunched over something on the mattress. It was hard to make out any details, but I could see the outline of someone, or something, shrouded in darkness, facing away from the camera. And then, almost like they knew I was watching, the figure turned slowly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of their face. It wasn't Josh. I don't even know if it was human. The face was blurred, distorted in a way that looked unnatural, like it was shifting and twisting under some invisible layer. But those eyes, cold, dark, empty, they were locked onto the camera, and I knew somehow that they were staring right at me. I couldn't look away. It felt like they were pulling me in, like those eyes were reaching through the screen. I was frozen, my heart pounding as that face came closer and closer until it filled the whole screen. Just those dead, black eyes staring right into mine. And then the feed cut off. The screen went dark, and I was left sitting there in silence, my own reflection staring back at me. I tried to steady my breathing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd just seen was far from over. Then my phone buzzed again, snapping me out of my daze. Another message from Scout. Just 2 words. Check outside. Every instinct I had screamed not to, but against all reason, I couldn't ignore it. I stood up, feeling like I was moving in slow motion, and walked over to the window. My heart was pounding as I pulled back the curtain and peered outside. There, standing in the middle of the street, was the same shadowed figure from Josh's apartment. They were just standing there, staring up at my window. Even from that distance, I could feel their gaze piercing through me. And as I watched, they slowly raised their hand, pointing directly at me. The message was clear. They wanted me to come out. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the fear. Maybe it was the sense that I couldn't escape them any longer. But I grabbed my jacket, shoved my phone into my pocket, and headed downstairs. I knew it was insane, but something inside me had snapped. I couldn't live with this fear anymore. If they wanted me, fine. I'd meet them on my own terms. When I got outside, the street was empty. The figure was gone, vanished, as if they'd never been there. I stood there, looking around, my breath visible in the cold night air. I didn't know what to expect, but the silence felt almost suffocating. And then, my phone buzzed one last time. It was Scout again, but this time, the message was different. A single line that chilled me to my core. It's done. You're part of it now. I stood there, staring at the message, feeling like the ground had just disappeared beneath my feet. I had no idea what that meant, what I'd become a part of, but the weight of those words settled over me like a shroud. The next day, I tried calling Josh again, but his number was disconnected. I even went by his apartment, but it was completely empty. It was like he'd never existed. No one knew where he'd gone, no trace of him anywhere. And as I stood in front of his empty building, I felt a sickening realization settle in. Whatever Scout was, whatever it had done to me and Josh, there was no escaping it. I'd been pulled into something I couldn't understand, something dark and unexplainable, and there was no way out. A few days later, I started getting messages again, but this time, they weren't warnings. They were instructions. They came late at night, always in the same cryptic tone, directing me to strange locations, urging me to observe, to report. I tried ignoring them at first, but the messages didn't stop, and every time I disobeyed, I'd see that shadowed figure outside my window, standing perfectly still, a silent reminder that I was never alone. I don't know what they want from me or how far this will go, but every time I close my eyes, I see those empty, dark eyes staring back at me, reminding me that I'm part of something now, something I can never walk away from. And now, all I can do is wait. Wait for the next instruction, the next game, the next scandal. Because like they said, I'm part of it now, and I don't think there's anything left of me they haven't already taken.